Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
You'd think by now I'd be used to it. Sunday lunch at my parents' house always comes with a side of condescension, a sprinkle of sarcasm, and at least one performance from Ethan, my older brother, who never quite grew out of being the family's golden boy, even when he started balding at 35 and still couldn't keep a relationship going longer than a football season. It's always the same table, same awkward small talk about local politics or high school sports no one actually cares about. Same lopsided smile from Mom, pretending she doesn't hear the subtle digs aimed at me every time I mention my job, my life, or anything remotely resembling independence. That Sunday, though, something felt off, like the air was thinner. Or maybe it was just the way Grandpa Walter had barely touched his roast beef. He was always the first to dive in, elbows on the table, making some half-inappropriate joke about cholesterol and dying happy. But that day, he just stared at his plate, fork in hand, watching all of us with those pale blue eyes that had seen war and widows, generations rise and fall. Maybe he already knew what was about to happen, or maybe he decided it was time. We were halfway through the mashed potatoes when it happened. Ethan leaned back, toothpick dangling from the corner of his mouth like some cheap movie villain, and looked straight at me with that smirk he used when we were kids, and he'd sneakily put chewing gum in my hair during church. "You know what Claire's always been?" he said, loud enough to cut through the soft clinking of silverware and Sunday politeness. "Average, that's what. Never caused trouble, never did anything worth bragging about either." The room didn't go silent immediately. It was more like a slow drain of sound, the way a faucet drips before it dies. My mother gave a nervous chuckle, the kind you make when you hope something awful can be laughed off. Dad pretended to chew slower, avoiding eye contact. My sister-in-law, Becky, lowered her glass of wine with the grace of a woman who just remembered she forgot to lock her car. But Grandpa Walter set his fork down. It wasn't loud, not a clang or a slam, but somehow that tiny sound sliced through the tension sharper than a cleaver. He wiped his mouth slowly, looked over at Ethan like he was seeing him for the first time in years, and then turned his gaze to me. And I swear, for a second, I saw pride, not just the kind a man has when his granddaughter does something decent, but a fierce, deliberate pride that said, "This one earned it." "Then why," he asked, his voice steady and calm, "is the family business in her name now?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was surgical. It cut, deep and cold. Ethan froze, toothpick still perched like a forgotten insult. My mom's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. No one dared speak. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, letting the heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from the feeling of years finally shifting. For the first time in my life, I wasn't in the background, and for the first time, Ethan didn't know what the hell to say. And here's where I want to ask you, watching this, how would you have reacted if someone publicly slapped your entire existence down with one lazy insult, only to be immediately and unexpectedly avenged by the one person everyone thought was too old to care? What would you do next? Would you gloat? Would you stay quiet like I did? Or would you start planning your next move? Because here's the truth they never saw coming. I didn't get the company by accident, and it damn sure wasn't a charity gift. It took 12 years of silence, working behind the scenes, fixing their mistakes, watching them take credit for things I solved, while pretending I was just helping out. After lunch, everyone pretended nothing happened. Ethan stormed out before dessert, muttering something about jokes and overreactions. My parents tried to change the subject to the weather, as if Grandpa hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of the dining room. But Grandpa? He waited until the plates were cleared, then looked at me and said quietly, "Hang back, kid. We need a word." We sat in the living room, just the two of us. No more performance, no more audience. He handed me a small metal key, no explanation, no instructions, just the kind of thing that makes your stomach tighten and your mind spin. "Basement office," he said. "File cabinet, bottom drawer, marked red, time you saw it." I didn't ask what it was, I just nodded. Because I'd learned by then, when Grandpa said something, there was always a reason. I waited until nightfall, after everyone left, after my parents went to bed pretending nothing in their carefully curated world had just cracked open. I went down into the basement, flicked on the yellow light, and pulled open the drawer. The folder inside was labeled in thick red marker, Plan B. And right then and there, I knew this was just the beginning. The thing about being the quiet one in a loud family is that people eventually stop looking at you altogether. They stop asking questions, stop paying attention, stop wondering where you are or what you're thinking, because they've built this easy little picture in their heads that you're content to orbit their lives like some dependable moon, always there, but never shining brighter than the star in the middle. And for a long time, maybe that's exactly how I let it seem. I smiled politely during the barbecues, brought pies to Christmas even when nobody ate them, and answered questions about my little accounting job with the kind of vague half-lies that made everyone comfortable and no one curious. But the truth was never so simple, and it certainly wasn't quiet. While Ethan was screwing up hiring decisions and pretending to be a visionary entrepreneur, I was the one spending my nights combing through financial statements, identifying leaks in the budget that should have drowned the company a decade ago. When their supplier in Jersey double-charged them for lumber shipments, I caught it. When the IRS came sniffing around about irregular payroll reports in 2015, it was me who cleaned it up, filled out the back paperwork, and made it all disappear with a few polite phone calls and a forged signature Grandpa never questioned. I didn't do it for thanks, and certainly not for applause. I did it because I loved that business more than any of them realized. Because in that dusty old wood shop, tucked behind the office and beneath decades of sweat, I found something that felt real, something that didn't require a spotlight to matter. But none of them knew, not even Grandpa. Not until that day 3 years ago when he walked into the shop on a Sunday morning and found me there alone, sleeves rolled up, balancing the books while the sawdust was still settling from the week's work. I remember how he stood there in the doorway, silent for what felt like minutes, just watching. And then he sat down next to me, looked at the ledgers I'd been maintaining behind Ethan's back, and said, "Tell me how long you've been doing this." I could have lied, could have downplayed it. But I didn't. I told him everything, from the first day I realized Ethan was too arrogant to admit he didn't understand overhead cost breakdowns, to the night I stayed up until 4 a.m., redoing all the employee contracts because he had accidentally misclassified 3 full-timers as part-time to save on insurance. That conversation changed everything. Not right away, not dramatically, but something shifted. He started calling me more often, asking about decisions, bouncing ideas off me late at night when he couldn't sleep. He asked me to meet with his lawyer just to go over some things, and then a few months later, quietly handed me a power of attorney form to sign, sealed inside an envelope like a secret too dangerous to say out loud. By the time he told me he'd changed the company's registration papers, listing me as the sole legal owner of Foster & Sons, it didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a burden, like holding onto a live wire you never asked for, but can't let go of, because you're the only one who knows where it connects. He didn't make a speech. He didn't even ask how I felt. He just said, "It's yours now. Don't tell them yet." I didn't ask why. I knew why, because he saw what I saw, that the business was rotting from the inside, that Ethan would run it into the ground with his half-baked expansions and empty ego, and that if someone didn't step in, Foster & Sons would become just another name on a dusty sign hanging over an abandoned lot. I had already been running the damn place, just without the title. Now I had the paperwork too. When I opened the Plan B folder, the first thing I saw was a letter, not typed, but handwritten, in Grandpa's slow, looping scrawl. It started with my name, and beneath it, a line I'll never forget. "Sometimes the right person for the job is the one no one saw coming." The folder held everything: bank statements, internal memos, even a copy of an anonymous whistleblower complaint from a few years ago, one that Grandpa had intercepted and quietly buried to protect Ethan. There were notes about me too, going back almost 10 years. Observations, recognitions, trust, earned quietly, recorded methodically. It was like he'd been building a case, not just for the company, but for me. And yet, in all those years, he never let on. I sat there in the basement for over an hour, going through every page, every document, feeling something twist in my chest. Not anger, not exactly, not pride either. It was something harder to name. Vindication, maybe, or some twisted cousin of it. All those years I thought I was invisible, and it turns out he'd seen everything. When I finally went back upstairs, the house was dark and silent, but my mind was louder than it had ever been. I knew what I had to do now, not just run the business, but make sure no one could take it from me again. Not Ethan, not my parents, not even Grandpa, if he changed his mind. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to wait to be seen. I was going to make damn sure they couldn't ignore me even if they tried. There's something quietly humiliating about realizing, years too late, that the person you spent most of your life orbiting like a planet around a sun was never as stable, as smart, or as significant as you were led to believe. Like pulling back a curtain only to discover the great and powerful wizard is just a sweaty man with a microphone and a knack for talking fast. That was Ethan, always full of noise, always full of certainty, always so quick to dismiss me with a wave of his hand, the same hand that couldn't fill out a balance sheet if his life depended on it, though he wore button-downs and cologne like they came with leadership built in. And for most of my life, I bought the story everyone else was selling, that he was the future, the heir, the obvious choice, not because he earned it, but because nobody ever bothered to imagine an alternative. What I didn't understand back then, what only became clear after Grandpa gave me the keys to the kingdom and the truth along with them, was that this dynamic wasn't unique. It wasn't some isolated drama between siblings. It was history. It was repetition. It was a family habit passed down like eye color or a bad knee. And it wasn't until I read through Grandpa's old notebooks, buried at the back of the Plan B folder under yellowing receipts and typed up meeting notes, that I started to see the pattern. Grandpa had a brother. I remembered hearing his name once or twice growing up, Joseph, but he was a ghost in our family lore, always mentioned vaguely and quickly, like a character that had been written out of the script and wasn't allowed back in. In the notes, though, there he was, vivid and angry, a man who had once been slated to take over the business when it was still just a workshop behind their father's barn. A man who, according to Grandpa's scribbled accounts, nearly bankrupted them in 1976 by making reckless investments and lying about the numbers. Sound familiar? What hit me hardest wasn't the betrayal itself. That was just business, and people mess up all the time. It was the way Grandpa described the fallout, the pain, the disappointment. The deep private grief of watching someone you love turn into someone you can't trust. And then the line that stuck with me like a splinter. You never expect it to be your own brother. That's when it clicked. That's when everything, the way Grandpa had watched me all those years, the cautious way he handed me responsibility, the decision to keep it all secret, made sense. I wasn't just the quiet one, the backup, the afterthought. I was the insurance policy. I was the second chance he never got from his own family. I wasn't replacing Ethan. I was replacing Joseph. Once I understood that, the guilt started to fade. I stopped second-guessing myself every time I made a decision about the business, stopped hesitating when I had to overrule something Ethan had proposed, stopped pretending I owed him an explanation. I started leading. The first move I made was a quiet one, surgical like a pressure point. Ethan's best friend, Mike, had been running the operations side of the company for nearly 5 years, mostly because he and Ethan shared a talent for looking busy while doing very little of actual value. He was charming, sure, and good at talking to suppliers, but he was also sloppy with records, late on schedules, and always seemed to disappear during crisis moments with a convenient excuse. I called him into my office, yes, my office, which used to be Grandpa's, and told him calmly that we were restructuring and his position was no longer aligned with the direction of the company. I used corporate language so he couldn't argue and handed him a severance package that would shut him up for at least a month. Word got around fast. People in the shop who had never looked me in the eye were suddenly sitting up straighter in meetings. A few of the older guys started calling me boss without a trace of irony. And Ethan didn't take it well. The call came just after 10 p.m. the next night. I should have let it go to voicemail, but part of me, maybe the old part, the one that still half believed I needed to answer to him, picked up. He was already drunk, I could tell from the way he slurred the word betrayal, as if he knew it was too dramatic but couldn't help himself. "You think you're somebody now," he snarled, voice thick with liquor and wounded pride. "You think this makes you important? You don't know what the hell you're doing." I didn't yell back. I didn't explain. I just listened. Let him rant. Let him spit out every bitter thing he'd probably been holding in for years. And when he finally stopped to breathe, I said, calmly, "I've known what I'm doing for a long time, Ethan. You were just too busy hearing yourself talk to notice." He hung up after that. And for a while, I just sat there in the dark, staring at my phone, feeling the weight of all the years I'd spent waiting to be taken seriously, and realizing for the first time that I no longer needed anyone's permission to be in charge. The next morning, I walked into the office early, made coffee the way Grandpa used to like it, and started drafting the next phase of restructuring. Ethan had declared war, whether he knew it or not. But this wasn't going to be a screaming match or a courtroom drama. This was going to be slow, deliberate, a burn from the inside. Because I wasn't just the second son. I was the last one standing. There's a certain satisfaction, dark, quiet, almost surgical, that comes with watching a person who spent their whole life convinced of their untouchability begin to realize, piece by piece, that the ground beneath them isn't solid anymore, that the rules they assumed would always bend in their favor have quietly been rewritten, and that the very people they've underestimated are the ones holding the pen. It doesn't happen all at once, and it never looks as dramatic as you think it will. There's no explosion, no immediate collapse, just a slow, steady unraveling like a suit thread catching on a nail, pulling tighter and tighter until the seams give out. That's how Ethan began to fall apart, not in a blaze of glory, but in a series of missed calls, botched meetings, and increasingly desperate attempts to assert a version of himself that no longer existed anywhere except in his own head. After firing Mike, the ripple through the company was almost immediate, though not loud. The shop floor started operating smoother, deadlines were met without drama, and the atmosphere shifted in small but measurable ways. People showed up on time, paperwork stopped disappearing, and the break room gossip, which used to orbit around Ethan's latest overreach, started shifting toward curiosity about me. I didn't force anything, I just started making decisions. Real ones. I eliminated our worst performing supplier, who had been giving us subpar lumber for years, and replaced them with a smaller, more reliable operation that saved us 20% on material costs within a month. I upgraded our internal systems, streamlined our invoicing, and restructured the pay scale so that the guys on the floor, many of whom had been there since I was a teenager sweeping sawdust on Saturdays, finally saw bonuses that weren't just hypothetical promises tied to Ethan's impossible sales targets. Still, I kept it quiet. No emails with big announcements, no company-wide speeches. I let the results speak for themselves, because I'd learned something Grandpa must have known all along. When you lead without noise, people lean in closer. They listen harder. They start to trust what they're seeing over what they're being told. Ethan, of course, didn't disappear. If anything, his presence became more erratic, more performative, as if he sensed something slipping through his fingers, but couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. He began showing up unannounced, pacing the offices with manufactured urgency, barking questions at staff who no longer reported to him, and holding on to this delusional belief that the company still revolved around his approval. He started pitching big ideas again, expansion plans, tech partnerships, some half-baked vision for an e-commerce platform none of us needed. All the usual smoke and mirrors, but this time, nobody bit. Because the numbers didn't lie, and for once, I made sure those numbers were visible to the right people. What finally broke him, though, wasn't a business decision. It was personal. For years, Ethan had been living beyond his means, propped up by loans he pulled from the company under vague pretenses, all logged under executive allowances, which Grandpa had let slide out of either blind hope or exhaustion. But now that I was in control, and now that the books had been cleaned, those little escape hatches started to close. And when the auditors, quietly hired by me under the guise of modernization, flagged several irregularities in his reimbursement requests, I did something he never expected. I froze his executive account. I didn't make a scene. I just sent him an email, copied the board, and attached a polite explanation. Until the financial discrepancies could be clarified and resolved, his access to company funds was suspended. It was a professional procedural move, but to Ethan, it was war. He showed up at the office the next morning red-faced, sweating through his shirt, demanding an emergency meeting with the board, most of whom, by that point, were already leaning toward me. He yelled, he threatened. He even accused me of forging documents, which only made him look more desperate when I calmly produced original copies, signed by Grandpa himself, in the presence of 2 witnesses. That was the day I saw it click for him, that I wasn't just playing a role, wasn't just keeping his seat warm. I was the seat now, and there was no place left for him to sit. By the end of that week, he'd gone silent. No more emails, no late-night calls, no dramatic office visits. I thought for a moment that maybe he'd accepted reality, that maybe he'd finally realized the smartest thing he could do was walk away with what dignity he had left. But I was wrong. It was the second Sunday lunch since the bomb had dropped, and despite everything, my mother insisted we keep things normal. For the family, she said, as if pretending nothing was burning around us would somehow rebuild the house. The table was quieter than usual, with the usual pleasantries now feeling forced, as if everyone was waiting for a second explosion but hoping it wouldn't come. Grandpa wasn't there. His health had taken a sudden turn, and he was recovering at home with a nurse, watching the chaos he'd sparked unfold from a distance. We were just finishing dessert when Ethan walked in, late and uninvited, suit jacket slung over his shoulder like a man returning from war with a victory in his pocket. He didn't sit. He just walked straight to the table, pulled a crisp manila envelope from his jacket, and dropped it in front of me. "Let's see how much of this you still control when the courts are through with you," he said. Inside was a lawsuit, his signature, his claims, his attempt to claw back control through legal firepower. He was accusing me of fraudulent transfer of ownership, breach of fiduciary duty, and a whole list of legal buzzwords strung together by a lawyer desperate enough to take his money. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the thing he had been hiding from all this time. The fear, the crumbling self-image, the man who built his entire identity on being the chosen one, now watching that identity rot under his feet. I stood up, folded the letter calmly, and slid it into my bag without a word. This wasn't over. But what Ethan didn't know, and what I was going to show him in time, was that you don't win wars by shouting the loudest. You win them by burning slowly. There's a moment, usually not in the courtroom, not during the argument, but right before the verdict, when time seems to warp and stretch, when you're forced to confront every decision that brought you to this exact point, wondering whether you were ruthless or righteous, calculating or courageous, wondering if the version of yourself you had to become in order to win is someone you'll be able to live with once it's over. I stood in that moment on a rainy Tuesday morning in a small wood-paneled courtroom filled with more tension than people, as Ethan sat across from me at the plaintiff's table, his tie too tight, his ego badly bruised but still puffed up just enough to believe this whole farce might actually work in his favor. He had filed the lawsuit fast, hoping to catch me off guard, counting on me to panic, or better yet, to back down completely. He wanted to drag our family business, our family name, and my reputation through the mud in front of anyone who'd listen, simply because he couldn't stand the fact that I had taken what he thought was his by birthright. What he didn't know, and what I had spent weeks preparing for, was that this wasn't my first confrontation with his kind of chaos. I had been living in its shadow for decades. memorizing its moves, learning how to predict every tantrum disguised as a strategy. And this time, I was ready. The courtroom wasn't dramatic like on TV. There were no gasps, no slam of the gavel, just paperwork, murmured objections, and the occasional sigh from the judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan's lawyer, a flashy, overconfident man in his early 40s with a voice like a used car ad, laid out a case full of stretched truths and cherry-picked documents, alleging that Grandpa had been coerced, that the company transfer was rushed and irregular, and that my handling of the business afterward was erratic and self-serving. They submitted emails out of context, claimed that Grandpa's recent illness meant he wasn't of sound mind when he signed the documents, and even implied that I had manipulated him emotionally to gain control. But then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't even glance at Ethan, because he wasn't the one I needed to prove anything to. I stood there and told the truth, not the one they knew, but the one they'd never bothered to ask about. I brought out the full set of financial records I had maintained for the past 10 years, showing how the business had been bleeding money under Ethan's watch, and how I had stabilized it, grown it, and modernized it in less than 18 months. I presented contracts, signed letters, and meeting minutes, all verified by witnesses. And then I pulled out the final piece, the video. Grandpa, knowing exactly how Ethan would react, had recorded a video 2 months before he got sick. A long, steady explanation in his own words, in his own voice, sitting in the very office he used to run the business from. In it, he laid everything bare. He explained the history, the failures, the moment he realized I was the one holding the company together behind the scenes. He named the embezzlement twice, not once, detailing the very transactions Ethan thought were buried. He explained that the transfer of ownership was deliberate, legally sound, and executed with full knowledge of what it meant. He ended the video by looking straight into the camera and saying, "Claire didn't take anything. I gave it to her because she earned it, and because she's the only one who ever really cared whether this business lived or died." The courtroom didn't react much. Again, no drama, but I saw the shift. I saw it in the judge's posture, in the way Ethan's lawyer shuffled his papers, in the way Ethan sank a little lower into his seat, as if some invisible weight had finally found him. The lawsuit didn't just crumble, it evaporated. The judge dismissed it with a formality that barely masked his disdain, and just like that, the fight Ethan thought he could win with threats and noise was over before it really began. I walked out of that courtroom into the cold air and didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I felt empty in a way I hadn't expected, like I had reached the summit of a mountain I'd been climbing for so long that I had forgotten what I was supposed to do once I got to the top. There was no applause, no parade, just silence. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until then. I had won, yes, but I had also lost something along the way. The next Sunday, there was no family lunch. My mother sent a short message saying she was tired, that things were still a little tense. My father didn't say anything at all. Ethan had gone quiet. Becky, his wife, who once offered me sympathetic smiles over shared bottles of wine, had left him 2 days after the trial. I was still running the business, stronger than ever, profitable, respected, but the cost of being seen, truly seen, had been high. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the shop floor from the upstairs window, watching the men move like clockwork, and I think about what it took to get here. I think about Grandpa and Joseph and patterns and legacy, and whether history repeats because we're lazy or because we're scared to rewrite it. I think about Ethan and whether he'll ever understand what he lost. Not the business, but the belief that someone would always clean up his messes. And then I think about me, about the girl who used to sit at Sunday lunch, silent and smiling, and wonder if she ever really disappeared, or if she just got tired of pretending. People ask me now if I'm happy, and I tell them truthfully that I'm not sure happiness is the point. Maybe what matters more is being able to look in the mirror and know that you didn't wait for someone else to give you permission to matter. Funny, isn't it? They called me average, but I'm the one left standing.